They told you that history is written in books, wrapped in dates, and sealed in polite stories. But history, real history, does not sit quietly in a library. It hides in kitchens, in basements, in locked diaries, in the trembling hands of widows who smile at the table while their husbands take their last sip of wine. You weren't supposed to hear this. You weren't supposed to know her name. Yet, here you are, and now it cannot be undone. Constance Grimsley, a woman whispered. About in Kentucky, Halls did not just bury husbands. She perfected the ritual of their disappearance. Picture this, a dimly lit southern home in the late 1800s. Oil lamps flicker. The wallpaper is damp with years of decay. In the kitchen, a black dress brushes the floor as she bends over her table. Before her lies a recipe book, not merely for food, but for endings. A teaspoon of spice, a drop of tincture, a smile across the table, and by dawn, another man is gone. Neighbors called it bad luck, sickness, divine punishment. They had no idea they were dining on her craft. But you are stepping deeper than they ever did. You are crossing a threshold most men never return from. This is not a story of love turned sour. This is a revelation of control, of mastery, of how one woman learned to bend life and death to her will. And here's the part that claws at you. Constance was never caught. She died with her secrets, intact. But the fragments she left, the recipes, the whispers, the funerals too close together, those fragments speak louder than any confession. Tonight, you will hear them. And once you do, you'll never look at a dinner table the same way again. So lean closer. The plates are set. The candles are lit. And somewhere, in the silence between bites, lies the oldest truth of all. What kills a man is rarely the blade he sees. It is the hand he trusts. Imagine the first husband. A man with calloused hands, proud of his work, proud of his authority in the home. He believed he was master of his table. Yet mastery is only an illusion when someone else controls the meal. Constance knew this. She learned, perhaps from her mother, perhaps from darker whispers carried through generations, that control is not about strength. It is about subtlety, and subtlety is best served in silence. The first dish was ordinary. A stew of beef and onions, simmered for hours in a black iron pot. But woven into it was a bitterness he could not taste until it was too late. He ate, he laughed, he boasted, and as the night stretched on, his laughter slowed, his body weakened, his pride melted into sweat and shivers. He died not with a cry of betrayal, but with confusion, unable to comprehend that the woman at his side was the architect of his undoing. This is where the lesson begins for you. Every system of power works the same way. Governments, churches, secret orders, they do not conquer by force alone. They season your life with their instructions, their traditions, their rules, disguised as comfort. You swallow without question, and by the time you taste the poison, it is already too late. Constance's table was no different from the world's institutions. Both feed men to death without them realizing they were ever a meal. Neighbors saw only a grieving widow. They brought her casseroles, offered prayers, and spoke of the fragility of life. None dared to question the odd timing of his decline, the strange smell in his breath, the way she never shed a tear when the coffin closed. Because when power wears the mask of grief, suspicion dies before it's born. And so, her method took root. She recorded nothing openly, yet the evidence of her craft is there, hidden in the margins of her cookbook, in stains that don't belong to flour or broth. The book itself became more than paper. It became scripture, a manual not of nourishment, but of control. If you are listening closely, you feel the unease creeping in now, because this is not simply about one woman in Kentucky. This is about you, about the systems you've trusted, about the meals you've consumed without question. And if a widow with nothing but a pot and a plan could rewrite the fate of men, imagine what institutions with centuries of practice have written into you. The second husband thought himself wiser. He had heard the whispers, the suspicions that trailed behind her like a shadow she never acknowledged. But he was charmed. That was her greatest weapon. Constance did not win men with beauty alone. She won them with presence. She had a way of listening, of making men feel as though they had been chosen, elevated, singled out by fate itself. And when a man believes he has been chosen, he ceases to guard himself. This is the poison of trust. Not the liquid poured into a glass, not the powder slipped into a stew, but the surrender of suspicion. When he sat at her table, he told himself he was safe. He told himself that fate would not allow two husbands to die in the same house. He told himself the lie every man tells when he wishes the world to remain simple. It cannot happen to me. But it did. His end came slower. She learned to refine her method, a little less of this, a little more of that, stretching the suffering into days instead of hours. He weakened gradually, blaming his decline on the weather, on age, on chance. And she fed him all the while, spoon after spoon, smile after smile. By the time his body collapsed, he was too entangled in her comfort to ever see her hand behind the veil. Now pause and think. Is this not the same way nations fall? The same way free men become slaves to systems they never questioned? It never begins with chains. It begins with comfort, with the illusion of safety, with the promise that those in power will provide, protect, preserve. And by the time the truth reveals itself, the people are already too weak to resist. Constance's secret was not merely in the kitchen. Her secret was in psychology. She understood something most men never do, that trust is the slowest, sweetest poison of all. And when you can feed trust, when you can stir it into every bowl and season it into every breath, you can kill without ever lifting a weapon. Do you see it now? Her home was not a home at all. It was a stage. The meal was not sustenance. It was ritual. And the husband was not a partner. He was the sacrifice. The neighbors wept again. The town shook its head again. And the widow, she simply closed the curtains, cleaned the dishes, and began preparing for the next act. By the time the third husband entered her home, whispers had grown louder. Yet whispers alone cannot kill a woman's reputation, not when society itself conspires to protect her. You must understand this. Constance was not simply a widow in black. She was a woman of her time, and in the late 1800s, women were assumed to be weak, fragile, incapable of orchestrating anything beyond the domestic. That assumption was her shield, stronger than iron bars. The third man was wealthier, more cautious, less easily deceived. He read contracts before signing them. He guarded his business affairs with suspicion. But at home, in the glow of lamplight, he let the armor slip. Why? Because institutions had trained him to. Society tells men that the battlefield is outside, in business, in war, in politics. But the home is sacred, untouchable, safe. That was the illusion. And illusions are the most dangerous cages of all. His death was not quick, nor was it clean. Constance refined her craft with surgical precision. A dose too large would raise suspicion. A dose too small would allow recovery. But the perfect measure, that left him sick enough to cling to her, desperate for her care, too weak to question the hand feeding him. And when he finally slipped into the grave, she played her role flawlessly. The grieving widow, pale with exhaustion, clutching her Bible, whispering prayers that dripped with false piety. Now, look deeper. Isn't this the same performance played by governments, churches, and corporations? They weaken you with toxins, not of the body, but of the mind. Distractions, addictions, comforts sold as cures. They make you sick, then offer you their hand as savior. And by the time you realize that the hand feeding you is the hand that poisoned you, you are already too far gone. This is why Constance's story matters. It is not merely a tale of a Kentucky widow and her vanished husbands. It is a mirror of the systems that govern your life. Every institution you trust feeds you, But do you know what's really in the bowl? Do you dare to lift the lid and smell the rot beneath the steam? The third husband never asked. He ate. He weakened. He died. And once again, the town bowed its head in pity. They believed they were witnessing tragedy. But what they were really witnessing was theater. Theater directed by a woman who understood power in its purest form. Unseen, unquestioned, unstoppable. By the time Constance buried her third husband, the whispers had become something else. Not merely gossip, but legend. Her name was spoken in hushed tones at markets and church pews. Some said she was cursed. Others swore she was chosen. But those who watched closely began to notice a pattern, one so precise it could not be coincidence. Every death, every funeral, every neatly folded black veil seemed orchestrated, as if following a script written long before she was born. What few understood was that Constance was not just practicing murder, she was practicing ritual. Each husband's death was timed with eerie precision, the waning of the moon, the turning of seasons, the dates whispered in old farmers' almanacs. Was this coincidence? Or had she uncovered something deeper, a rhythm hidden in the fabric of life, a dark alchemy of timing and intent? You must understand, in forbidden histories, food was never only food. From ancient Rome to secret brotherhoods of Europe, meals were the stage of initiation. Wine was more than drink, it was blood. Bread was more than sustenance, it was covenant. And when Constance stirred her pot, she was not merely cooking. She was performing the oldest ritual of all, transforming trust into submission, and submission into death. Think about it. Every institution that has ever ruled men has used ritual disguised as routine. A church service, a courtroom oath, a soldier's pledge. Repeated acts, familiar acts, that slowly engrave obedience into the mind. By the time the man realizes he has surrendered, he is no longer a man. He is a subject, a sacrifice. Constance's table was smaller, but no less powerful. Her kitchen became her cathedral. Her cookbook became her scripture, and her husband's. They became her congregation, each one giving himself over to her, body and soul. Without realizing he was kneeling before an altar. This is the forbidden truth. Control does not require chains, nor swords, nor threats. It requires repetition. A smile, a meal, a routine so ordinary, it blinds the victim to the extraordinary trap. And just as the institutions of the world feed you false truths disguised as nourishment, so too did Constance feed her men to death, and they thanked her for it. So ask yourself, how many of your routines are rituals you never chose? How many of your meals, your prayers, your daily comforts are poisons dressed as blessings? Constance knew the answer, and that knowledge gave her power few men will ever understand. What kept Constance safe was not her cooking alone. It was the silence of those around her, the neighbors who brought pies to her doorstep, the priest who praised her devotion, the doctor who signed the death certificates without question. Every man who should have spoken instead lowered his head, and in lowering their heads, they became her accomplices. This is how corruption survives, not through brilliance, but through blindness. The human instinct to avoid discomfort is stronger than the instinct to pursue truth. A neighbor may notice that 3 men in one house is too many to bury. A doctor may wonder why symptoms never match the illness he names. A priest may feel unease in his chest when he sees a widow to calm at the grave. But none will speak, because to speak is to unravel the illusion they depend on. And so silence becomes the mortar that holds the entire structure of lies in place. Do you see the reflection yet? Governments do the same. Banks do the same. Secret societies and ancient orders do the same. They depend not on universal belief, but on strategic silence. A few question, many suspect, but the majority prefer comfort to conflict, and thus the system survives, not because it is unbreakable, but because no one dares to break it. Constance understood this instinct better than most. She played the role of the grieving widow so perfectly that the town itself wanted to believe. Her they needed to. For if they questioned her, they would also be forced to question themselves, their churches, their courts, their assumptions about womanhood, safety, and home. So instead, they chose blindness, and in that blindness, she thrived. Each funeral was not just an ending but a performance, a test she passed again and again. She bowed her head, she wore her black veil, she spoke of heaven's will, and the town swallowed her words like holy bread. They did not realize they were attending not funerals, but ceremonies of power. Power she wielded in silence, under their very noses. Remember this: every tyrant, every corrupt priest, every faceless institution survives because someone chooses silence. Constance was not merely one widow in Kentucky. She was a reflection of the oldest truth. Evil never hides itself perfectly. It is we who choose not to see. Among the few artifacts left behind after Constance's death, one stood apart from the rest: an old, worn cookbook. Its spine cracked, its pages yellowed, its margins stained. To most, it looked harmless, the kind of family heirloom every kitchen keeps tucked away. But those who looked closer saw something else. Between the recipes for stews and breads, soups and pies, were odd notes scribbled in the margins. Measurements that didn't quite make sense. Ingredients that seemed out of place. Words underlined, circled, repeated as if someone had been encoding more than food within its pages. This is the forbidden truth about objects of power. They rarely look dangerous. A holy book, a constitution, a charter, a ritual manual, all appear as simple ink on paper. But hidden in the margins, between the lines, lies the control. Those who can read it see the system for what it is. Those who cannot become its slaves. Cookbook was her grimoire, her ledger, her scripture. Each annotation was not just a culinary adjustment, but a calibration of death. She was perfecting a system. Too much of one ingredient caused suspicion. Too little left her victims alive. But the precise blend, that was mastery, and mastery always leaves a mark. Is this not the same with history itself? The official story is the recipe, the one written for the masses. But the truth is scribbled in the margins, in the footnotes, in the documents never meant to be read. The rulers of old empires, the secret orders behind thrones, the institutions that shape your beliefs, all of them cook from hidden recipes, serving the people meals laced with control, and the masses, blind to the margins, consume it gratefully. So, when you imagine her cookbook, imagine more than pages and ink. Imagine a mirror of every institution that has ever fed you its version of reality. What have you swallowed without question? What ingredients have been slipped past your tongue, disguised as tradition, morality, or patriotism? Constance's cookbook is not merely about husbands who vanished. It is about the blueprint of power itself, a system refined, encoded, preserved, in something as ordinary as a recipe. Because the most dangerous truths are never hidden in vaults. They are hidden in plain sight, in things so familiar that you stop asking questions. Poison was only half her craft. The other half was perception. Constance understood something that most men never do. Death begins in the mind long before it touches the body. If she could shape how her husbands saw her, how they remembered her, how they believed in her, then the poison in the stew was almost unnecessary. Think of it. The first moment a man questioned his health, he turned not to a doctor, not to a friend, but to her. She became the mirror of his fears, the keeper of his comfort. And when he doubted, she silenced his doubt with a smile, with a touch, with the gentle assurance that he was simply tired, that life was simply heavy. He believed her because he wanted to believe her. Desire, after all, is the most obedient servant of deception. This is the secret institutions have always known. Churches preach not just to your soul, but to your fears. Governments legislate not merely your actions, but your perceptions. Corporations sell not products, but identities. convincing you that you are incomplete without what they offer. By the time you question, you are already defined by the lies you accepted. Constance was no different. She crafted her identity as the perfect wife, the devoted caretaker, the grieving widow. Each role she played was a mask, and men do not fear masks they cannot see through. They embrace them, even as those masks consume them. Her husbands never died alone. They died believing they were loved, cherished, watched over, even as the very hand holding them was the hand extinguishing their breath. Ask yourself how many of your memories are your own, and how many were fed to you. How many of your beliefs were born from your own mind, and how many were planted by someone who smiled as they slipped them into your life. Memory can be poisoned, belief can be bent, perception can be shaped until you no longer recognize what is real. That was Constance's true power, not the bottle in the cupboard or the powder in the broth, but her ability to make men surrender their suspicion. She rewrote their perception so completely that they walked willingly into her ritual. They trusted her more than they trusted themselves. And when a man no longer trusts his own instincts, he is already finished. Her table was not merely a place of nourishment, it was an altar. And her husbands, one after another, were sacrifices. Most men of her time would never have seen it this way, but history has always been written in blood, disguised as ceremony. The Aztecs raised knives to the sky, spilling human hearts to feed their gods. The Romans executed prisoners as public spectacle, dressing death in the garments of entertainment. Even the church, cloaked in piety, turned burnings and hangings into sacred rites. Constance needed no temple. Her kitchen became one. Each meal she served was more than food. It was offering. Each husband who weakened under her care was not merely a victim but a participant in a ritual he could not recognize. And this is the forbidden truth. Sacrifice does not require consent. It requires only structure, a system that convinces the victim that his death serves order. Her home provided that structure. A house, a marriage, a dinner table. The oldest altars are always the most ordinary. Do you see how this mirrors today? Sacrifice did not end with ancient empires. It simply changed costume. Men give their blood to endless wars, told their death preserves freedom. Workers surrender their lives to machines and offices, told their exhaustion fuels progress. Citizens pour their taxes into corrupt systems, told their sacrifice sustains society. And just as Constance fed her husband's poisoned meals disguised as love, institutions feed you poisoned truths, disguised as duty. What is the difference, really? A man drained of life at his dinner table, or a man drained of soul at his desk? A husband dead by stew, or a soldier dead by a politician's decree? Both are sacrifices, and both are demanded by systems that smile as they devour you. Constance may have acted alone, but she reflected an older pattern, one that echoes in every age. Her husbands were not simply men, they were offerings. Their suffering was not random, it was ritual. And once you see it for what it is, the illusion of safety begins to rot. Remember this, the world you live in still demands sacrifices. The question is not whether they will take them, but whether you will realize it before your name is called to the table. When her story spread, it did not move through books or sermons. It slipped through whispers, carried like smoke from one fearful mouth to another. People said her shadow lingered long after she was gone, that the chair at her table creaked by itself, as though waiting for another victim to sit down, that the air in her kitchen remained heavy, thick with the taste of rot and iron. But whispers always grow into something more dangerous. They turn into patterns. And in those patterns lies the truth that no one dares to name. Some claimed Constance was not unique, that she was part of something older, a hidden line of women who knew the recipes of death, who passed their craft not through books, but through silence. A pinch of this root, a shaving of that bark, a touch of powder slipped into soup. These women were never written into history, for men wrote the histories, and men feared the ones who could kill them without ever raising a weapon. But if you trace carefully, you find their shadows in the medieval texts that warn of veneficae, poison women, in the hushed stories of Italy's widowmakers who sold potions to wives desperate for freedom, in the grim tales of powdered arsenic hidden inside lace sachets, inhaled with every breath. Was Constance truly taught? Or did she discover these secrets on her own, guided by something darker? Perhaps both. The art of poison has always been less about ingredients and more about patience, about control, about watching someone suffer slowly, unable to escape. Poison is not the weapon of chaos. It is the weapon of order. It is the ritual of delayed inevitability. And this is why her story lingers like a curse, because it reveals that ordinary spaces, a kitchen, a dinner table, a shared meal, can hide forces more sinister than any battlefield. Her crime was not just murder, it was initiation. Each husband was a test, each death a lesson perfected. Ask yourself, how many Constances have there been, erased from record, their skills hidden in footnotes, their rituals buried in the silence of fearful men? History would tell you she was alone, but history has lied before. The story of Constance should have ended in that kitchen, with the final body lowered into the ground. But history is not neat. It is a chain, and each link binds us to what came before. Poison, the slow death, did not die with her. It only evolved. You see, poison is not always a bottle labeled with a skull and crossbones. It is the quiet, unseen element that eats away at the body while the victim smiles, unaware. And what was once the work of a woman at her table became, over time, the work of empires, governments, industries. In Constance's world, the dose was slipped into wine. In ours, it comes with a label, wrapped in bright colors, sealed by law, trusted by millions. Preservatives that corrode the gut, chemicals that weaken the mind, pesticides buried so deep in the soil that the fruit itself carries the seed of its own corruption. Do you think this is an accident? Or is it the modern face of the same old art, perfected, scaled, industrialized? The genius of poison is patience. It does not need to kill quickly. It needs to erode slowly, until the victim cannot even recall the moment death began. And is this not what we see now? Lifespans that stretch longer, yet health collapses earlier? Children born into a world where sickness is normalized, where dependence on medicine is expected, where the body itself becomes the battlefield, and still, people trust. They trust the table placed before them, just as Constance's husbands once trusted her smile. They eat, they drink, they live in the illusion that safety comes with familiarity. But what if the lesson of Constance is this? The closer the hand that feeds you, the greater the danger. Look again at her legacy. She was not chaos. She was not madness. She was structure, ritual, calculation. She taught us that the deadliest forces are not the loudest, but the quietest. The invisible ones that slip past your defenses because they feel so familiar. The question is no longer whether Constance acted alone. The question is whether she was simply a small mirror of a much larger truth that the world itself has become, her kitchen. And we are all seated at her table. History books would have us believe Constance was an anomaly, a lone wife gone mad in her kitchen. But dig deeper, and you will find the same story told across centuries, in whispers, in court records, in sudden deaths no physician could explain. Constance was not alone. She was part of a tradition. In Renaissance Italy, there was Lavoie, a woman who sold powders of death to desperate noblewomen trapped in arranged marriages. She whispered that freedom could be poured into a cup. Across France, poisons passed through convent walls, hidden in rosaries and candles, traded like holy relics. In Russia, noble courts employed women who specialized in subtle removals, wives who learned the slow art of inheritance through death. Even in Japan, Whispers tell of women who ground nightshade into a paste, serving it in tiny doses until a rival withered away, as if cursed by a ghost. They called them poisoners, but in their world they were something more, arbiters of fate. They held the power men claimed for themselves the right to decide who lived and who did not. Where swords and armies carved power in daylight, poison carved it in shadow. Constance, whether she knew it or not, was standing in that lineage. She was part of a silent sisterhood. Women who, denied open power, created their own kingdom in kitchens and apothecaries, in the folds of herbs and powders. Death became their language, and secrecy their church. But do not mistake this for empowerment. It was darker than that. These women were priests of despair, baptizing themselves in a craft that consumed not only their victims, but their own humanity. For once you have tasted the control that comes from watching another breathe their last, once you have mastered the patience of slow death, how could ordinary life ever satisfy you again? And so the lineage stretched forward like a black thread through history. Courts fell, dynasties shifted, wars ignited, not always from armies, sometimes from a cup of wine, a plate of food, a single shared kiss. Behind it, always, a shadowed hand, often a woman's, tracing the same arc Constance once traced. Poison was never just a method, it was a legacy, and if you think it died with those old wives and mistresses, then you are already underestimating how alive it still is. If Constance and her shadow sisters carried a legacy, then the scripture of that legacy was written in books no one was ever supposed to see. Manuals of poison, clandestine grimoires, hidden recipes written in coded language, tucked inside herbal guides, disguised as harmless cookbooks. To the untrained eye, they spoke of rosemary and thyme, of ointments for headaches or salves for fevers. But to those who could read between the lines, they were arsenals. In the medieval period, apothecaries guarded these secrets like priests. There were treatises that spoke, in delicate phrasing, of remedies for troublesome husbands. Others gave instructions on extracting venom from toads, or rendering belladonna into a syrup so sweet a child would drink it willingly. The infamous aqua tofana, a colorless, tasteless liquid, was said to be passed in recipe form among widows, who shared it like communion. 1 drop with wine, 2 with soup. The husband would not last the month. Authorities knew these texts existed, and they feared them. Inquisition records speak of women dragged from their homes, accused not of witchcraft, but of possessing a book too dangerous to be read. Pages were burned in public squares, their ink curling into smoke. But books are more resilient than fire. The words lived on, hidden in margins, recopied by trembling hands. Each generation kept the secret alive, as if the recipes themselves demanded to survive. There are whispers that some of these manuals never disappeared, that in the libraries of certain old families, locked behind false walls, there remain volumes bound in cracked leather, instructions for crafting powders that no modern science has fully traced, recipes written in riddles, describing how to milk the moonlight from a lily or call sleep from the roots of mandrake. To skeptics, they sound like nonsense, but to the initiated, they are codes, and in those codes is death. Think of the terror this inspired in rulers. Kings and emperors could guard against assassins with swords. But how do you guard against a single drop, invisible, slipped into your goblet at dinner? How do you protect yourself from knowledge itself, knowledge passed in whispers, bound in books, carried by women no one suspected until it was too late? This is why governments burned those pages, not to destroy the women who used them, but to destroy the very possibility of their memory. But like poison itself, memory seeps. It clings. It waits. The story of poison did not end with burned manuscripts and whispered recipes. It evolved. It slipped from kitchens and convents into laboratories and state offices. By the 20th century, poison was no longer the craft of women in hidden rooms. It became the favored weapon of governments, spies, and secret police. In the shadowy world of espionage, poison was the perfect tool. It was silent, invisible, and deniable. No gunshot, no knife wound, just a sudden collapse, a mysterious illness, a heart that stopped beating without warning. And always, the question, was it fate, or was it murder? Consider the Soviet Union. The KGB maintained entire laboratories dedicated to toxins. Their scientists experimented with ricin, curare, cyanide, and compounds so obscure they had no name outside their files. In 1978, Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov walked across Waterloo Bridge in London. A stranger bumped into him, carrying an umbrella. Inside its tip was a tiny pellet filled with ricin. 3 days later, Markov was dead. To this day, the case remains one of the most chilling examples of modern poison as political weapon. But the Soviets were not alone. The CIA, too, experimented with toxins. Declassified documents reveal attempts to create truth serums from psychoactive plants and venoms. There were plans for pills that would cause heart failure without detection, for powders that could be blown across a room to incapacitate a target. Even today, the full scope of these programs remains classified, buried in files marked never to be released. And it wasn't just governments. Criminal syndicates learned from history, refining the methods of their predecessors. The mafia in Sicily was said to favor poison for those who had to be removed quietly. No gunfire, no blood, just a glass of wine, a piece of fruit, a simple handshake before dinner. What makes poison so terrifying is not only the death it brings, but the fear it breeds. A soldier can see a sword, a bodyguard can deflect a bullet. But how do you defend? Against the unseen, against a kiss that carries death, against a glass raised in friendship that hides betrayal. Modern forensic science has made detection harder to escape, yes, but the principle remains. Poison is the weapon of those who do not want to be seen. It is the whisper of violence, the shadow in the glass, and it has never gone away. What kind of mind chooses poison? Unlike the sword, the gun, or the dagger, poison demands patience. It demands secrecy. The poisoner does not face his victim in open combat. He watches, waits, and lets the substance do the work for him. This is why, throughout history, poisoners have been regarded with a particular kind of disgust, contempt even greater than that reserved for ordinary killers. To stab a man is to fight him. To shoot him is to declare your intent. But to poison him, that is to kill while smiling. It is to share bread with someone, to pour them a drink, to let them believe they are safe while secretly ensuring their end. Poison is betrayal distilled. Psychologists note that poisoners often display traits of control and calculation. They are not impulsive murderers. They plan meticulously. They study the smallest details: what their victim eats, when they drink, whether they take sugar in their tea. A single careless mistake can reveal them. And so, they learn to live in shadows, to weave lies as carefully as they mix their powders. Women, in particular, were historically drawn to poison, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. In eras when brute violence was denied to them, poison was a weapon that required no physical strength. It offered a way to resist oppressive husbands, to gain freedom, or to claim power in a world that locked them out. History, of course, judged them harshly. The woman who killed with a blade might be seen as desperate. The woman who killed with poison was branded a witch, and yet, poisoners are often remembered with a strange, fearful fascination. They do not fit neatly into the category of killers. They are something more elusive, more disturbing, perhaps because they blur the line between intimacy and death. To be poisoned is to be betrayed by the very things meant to sustain you: food, drink, even a lover's touch. Modern criminology still records poisoners as distinct. They are rarer today, but when they appear, they strike a chord of dread deeper than most. Because poison is not just about killing the body, it is about control, domination, and the silent announcement, I decide when you live and when you die. And so, in every courtroom, every archive, and every whispered legend, the poisoner remains an object of morbid curiosity. They are the killers who hide in plain sight. If poison is the weapon of shadows, then its wielders often become shadows themselves, half legend, half truth. Some of the most infamous names in history belong not to warriors or kings, but to those who mastered the art of hidden death. Take Locusta, the Roman poisoner. She was not a noble woman, nor a soldier, but a specialist hired by emperors to solve their problems in silence. Locusta created concoctions so deadly and precise that she became indispensable to the ruling elite. When Emperor Nero wished to rid himself of his stepbrother Britannicus, he turned to her. The boy collapsed at a banquet, his life snuffed out. Between one sip and the next, Locusta's fame spread, not as a monster, but as a craftswoman of death. Rome called her the poison factory of emperors. Centuries later, in Renaissance Italy, another name emerged, Lucrezia Borgia. Whether truth or propaganda, her reputation dripped with venom. Tales accused her family of using poisoned rings, hollowed-out jewels, and spiced wine laced with death. Was Lucretia herself a poisoner, or merely a pawn in her father's and brothers' schemes? Historians still debate. But the fact remains, her name became a symbol of deceit, whispered in courts across Europe. To this day, the word Borgia conjures images of silken treachery and secret cups. Then there was Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France. Her court became infamous for its supposed flying squadron of women beautiful spies who, it was rumored, carried poison as readily as perfume. Whether she truly orchestrated assassinations through venom, or whether it was the slander of rivals. Catherine's reputation as a Black Widow queen has endured for centuries. These figures, cloaked in rumor and fear, became more than individuals. They became archetypes, the poisoner as sorceress, as seductress, as silent hand guiding the fate of kings. In truth, their stories may have been exaggerated by enemies who found it easier to accuse a woman of poison than a man of politics. But in the public mind, poisoners belonged to a realm of the uncanny half-human, half-phantom. The fascination endures because poisoners remind us of something we dread, that death does not always come from battlefields or assassins in the night. Sometimes it comes from the chalice you lift in trust. Sometimes it comes from the hands of those closest to you. The widows poisoned promised by the winter of 1906. Whispers of Constance's peculiar luck with husbands had started to spread beyond her circle of acquaintances. 3 men gone, each under circumstances that were curious at best and sinister at worst, and yet the Kentucky widow carried herself as though nothing unusual had ever touched her doorstep. Her black dresses became part of her image, her solemn expressions a mask that no one dared to question, but beneath the veil of mourning was a woman calculating her next move. Constance had grown bolder, more assured that her methods left no trace the law could follow. Each death had been a performance, and she was the only one who knew the script. She discovered that arsenic was not just a weapon, it was a promise. It promised silence, control, and the kind of freedom a woman of her time was rarely afforded. Her gatherings continued, though the laughter was thinner, edged with unease. Neighbors noticed that Constance never truly wept for long. Her grief seemed rehearsed, her tears quick to dry. Some said she spoke of her departed husbands with a peculiar detachment, like characters in a story rather than flesh and blood men who had once shared her home. And yet, because she was a widow, a role society, painted as fragile and pitiable, few dared to suspect her of malice. There were rumors, of course, quiet conversations in church pews and at market stalls, murmurs that perhaps the Grim Reaper did not follow Constance, but instead worked through her. A neighbor once claimed she had seen Constance purchasing rat powder more than once, though she could not prove it. Others recalled how often her husbands fell suddenly ill after meals she alone had prepared. Still, nothing tied her to their graves. The police files on her first 3 marriages were thin. Doctors wrote gastritis, pneumonia, heart failure. Coroners signed off without a second thought. And so Constance Grimsley walked the streets of Kentucky untouched, her black parasol shading her face, her hands folded like any respectable lady. But she was not finished. Not yet. The hunger inside her grew with each success, as though the act itself, not the inheritance, not the freedom, fed something deeper. She had begun to believe she was untouchable. The poison did not just kill her husband, it preserved her secret. And with every dose, she slipped into a cup. Constance was writing a new kind of recipe, one for power, one for survival, and one that would ensure her name lingered long after her victims were gone. Asterisk, by now, you may feel the walls of this story closing in, like the air in the room has grown heavier, as if some unseen weight presses against your chest. That's no accident. Because what Constance Grimsley mastered wasn't simply the art of poisons. No. What she perfected was something older, something far more dangerous. The art of invisibility. Not literal invisibility, but social invisibility. She understood that the most dangerous person in any society is the one nobody suspects. A woman in black, cooking for her husband, serving tea, kneading bread. Who would accuse her? Who would dare whisper that the very hands that folded linens might also measure out death? This is why so many men disappeared under her care. Their bodies collapsed in stages. First the weakness, then the fever, then the wasting. And each time, the town physician chalked it up to natural decline. Each death was a tragedy, yes, but never a crime. She was a widow surrounded by sympathy, cloaked in pity, wrapped in the armor of her own performance. But here is the question you need to ask yourself. How many other Constances walked among us, hidden, not in black lace and veils, but in uniforms, titles, and offices of power? You see, Constance's cookbook wasn't just a collection of recipes. It was a metaphor for a deeper truth. The systems that rule you, the authorities that govern you, they too keep a book of recipes. Formulas for control, instructions for keeping you docile, a pinch of fear, a spoonful of distraction, a dash of entertainment, and before you know it, your strength has bled out, and you don't even remember when it began. Every man who ate her stew thought he was safe, until he wasn't, and every man living today thinks he is free, until the veil lifts and he sees the truth, that the food, the news, the narratives, the very comfort he consumes, are seasoned with something poisonous. Something meant to weaken him without him ever realizing it. Constance Grimsley's genius wasn't just in what she killed, it was in how she made death look ordinary. And that is the same genius of the world you live in now. Death dressed up as normal, poison disguised as progress, submission hidden inside the illusion of choice. The storm broke. Not with thunder, but with whispers. By the mid-1800s, neighbors began to wonder why every man who entered Constance's household eventually wasted away. Why each funeral left her a little richer, a little more respected, a little more untouchable. Yet still, no one dared confront her. This is the trick. The darker the truth, the more people look away. It is easier to accept coincidence than to confront evil sitting across your dinner table. Easier to believe the body is simply weak than to accept that the soup itself is killing you. Constance knew this. She played it like a violin. Her hands shook at gravesides. Her voice cracked with grief. Her veils grew thicker with each passing season. And with every tear, she bought herself more time to perfect her recipes. She wasn't just cooking meals. She was crafting performances. A ritual of innocence so convincing that even suspicion itself lost its appetite. But eventually, the ledger of the dead grew too heavy to ignore. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became accusations. And when they searched her home, when they turned out the cupboards and pried open the hidden drawers, they found the book. The leather-bound volume stained with powders and oils. Inside pages, inked with meticulous notes, lists of ingredients, measurements written with the precision of a surgeon. Some of the names of the victims were scrawled in the margins, like annotations in a cookbook. Each man catalogued not as a husband, not as a father, but as an experiment. Imagine it. The town holding their breath as the evidence passed from hand to trembling hand. A woman who had served them bread and broth, now revealed as a machine of silence, of death. But here's the part they won't teach you in history books. Constance was never punished as she should have been. Why? Because to punish her was to admit they had been blind. To drag her through trial was to confess that the community itself had failed. That for years they had eaten from her hands and never questioned. And so, the record was softened. The cookbook disappeared into private archives. The story faded into gossip, and Constance walked into shadow, her black dress blending with the night. The question you should be asking now is this. When evidence is found of something too horrifying, does society expose it or bury it? How many truths, just like her cookbook, are locked away in hidden archives, never meant for you to read? The cookbook should have been destroyed. That would have been the logical choice, the safe choice. Fire it, scatter the ashes, let the wind carry away every trace of her quiet murders. But that's not what happened. Instead, the leather-bound book was taken into custody by a local magistrate, a man who fancied himself a collector of curiosities. He could not resist the allure of something so sinister. He locked it away. In his private study, stacked neatly among rare medical texts and alchemical volumes. It was never evidence. It was never meant for justice. It was a trophy, and from there, the book began its second life. You see, recipes are only dangerous when someone follows them, and someone did. The magistrate's son, fascinated by forbidden knowledge, began to copy his mother's handwriting into fresh journals, making improvements, adjustments, experiments of his own. Soon after, the town saw a fresh string of unexplained deaths. The victims were different now, no longer husbands, but animals, servants, drifters. Easier targets, easier to erase. The poison didn't just move through bloodstreams. It moved through generations, from Constance to the magistrate to his son. The knowledge metastasized like a cancer. You cannot kill an idea with silence, especially an idea as potent as the art of invisible murder. And the book itself, it vanished again. The family that held it left the town under cover of darkness. Record suggests they traveled south, then east, carrying with them the tainted heirloom. By the early 1900s, rumors of the widow's cookbook began to surface in other states, tucked into collections of occult writings and whispered about in circles of amateur poisoners. Some claimed it resurfaced in Chicago. Others swore it turned up in New Orleans, bound in new leather. Its pages annotated in multiple hands. To this day, collectors of forbidden texts, yes, they exist, hidden in plain sight, still whisper about the book. A simple kitchen manual, dressed in ordinary words, that carries death between its lines. And here's the unsettling truth. Nobody knows if it has survived. Perhaps it lies rotting in an attic. Perhaps it is buried beneath dust in an archive, mislabeled as domestic remedies. Or perhaps it sits in someone's kitchen drawer, waiting for the wrong hands to turn a page. If you think this sounds like superstition, ask yourself this. Why is it that certain recipes, written in the simplest of words, can still kill without leaving a trace? And why do authorities dismiss stories of the book so quickly, as though silence is safer than acknowledgement? The whispers never stopped. They only adapted by the mid-20th century. The widow's cookbook had slipped fully into legend. Scholars dismissed it as folklore. Newspapers mocked it as kitchen witchery. But behind the ridicule were reports too coincidental to ignore cases that bore the same invisible fingerprints of Constance Blackwood. A man in Ohio died suddenly in 1947. His death was ruled heart failure, but neighbors recalled his wife serving him a strange broth days earlier from a recipe she refused to share. A girl in Louisiana in 1959 allegedly told her school friends that her grandmother owned a death recipe book, one she was never allowed to open. In 1974, police investigating a string of unsolved family poisonings in Pennsylvania discovered a notebook half recipes, half chemical experiments. At the back, one chilling note, adapted from the widow's kitchen. Of course, none of this was admissible. No jury accepts whispers. No court convicts a recipe. But the pattern generation after generation mirrored the very reason Constance's book was so dangerous. It spread like seed. You didn't need the original volume, a copied page, a remembered formula. Even an overheard instruction was enough. And then, the digital age came. This is where the story becomes far more unsettling. In forgotten corners of the internet, among boards dedicated to obscure alchemy, herbalism, and occult sciences, users began referencing the widow's way, posts describing tinctures that leave no mark, recipes dressed as wellness tonics or teas for peaceful sleep. Once again, written plainly, hidden among everyday instructions just as Constance had designed them. Some claimed to have digital scans of the book. Others insisted the real text had been auctioned quietly to a private collector for a sum too large to ignore. No proof ever surfaced. Yet scattered testimonies appeared, people who swore they saw the handwriting, who claimed the ink itself seemed to bleed on the page, who repeated the same phrase attributed to Constance: "The meal is love, the death is mercy." Authorities have tried to erase these digital traces. Entire forums vanish overnight, taken down without explanation. Search long enough, and you'll find only fragments, screenshots of recipes with ingredients carefully blurred, and always, the same warning from those who stumbled too close. If you find the widow's cookbook, do not read it. Even knowing the words is enough to plant the seed. But of course, the mind is a traitor. Once you've heard of a forbidden book, curiosity eats at you. That hunger, the same hunger that drew the magistrate, his son, and countless others, the true poison. And perhaps that was always Constance's legacy, not just the recipes themselves, but the knowledge that hidden inside the everyday, inside a kitchen, inside a meal, lurks the possibility of quiet, undetectable murder. A widow's ritual. Constance Grimsley's legend carried more than whispered tales of poison. It spoke of rituals, private ceremonies she performed after each husband was buried. Neighbors described how she would lock herself in her parlor for hours, candles flickering against the drawn curtains. The smell of burning herbs, wormwood, rue, and sagewood leak into the night air. To the untrained eye, it may have seemed like mourning, but to those who paid closer attention, it looked like celebration. On one occasion, a midwife recalled being summoned to the Grimsley home, only to find the widow dancing barefoot on her wooden floors, muttering verses from a worn leather book. In the center of the room, a silver tray carried objects that seemed to represent her dead husband, his pipe, a button, a half-empty bottle of bourbon. When the midwife asked about it, Constance smiled coldly. "Every man leaves a taste behind. I simply rid myself of it." Such accounts painted her less as a grieving widow, and more as a practitioner of something darker. Kentucky's backroads in the 19th century were full of whispers about kitchen witches, who blended household remedies with forbidden rituals. Constance, with her uncanny knowledge of plants and her ability to feign innocence, may have stood at the boundary between healer and executioner. Her so-called recipe wasn't just in the pot. It was in the ritual of erasure, removing her husband, not only from her life, but from memory itself. After each death, she replaced furniture, burned linens, repainted walls. It was as if she could not stand to live among the ghosts of those she had buried. This obsessive cleansing struck some as grief, others as guilt, and still others as something far more deliberate, the completion of her work, in time. Locals noticed a pattern. Each funeral was followed not by withdrawal but by reinvention. Within weeks, Constance would be seen strolling into town in a new dress, a faint smile upon her lips, speaking of plans for expansion, property, or new investments. Where most widows shrank under the weight of sorrow, she seemed to grow stronger. It was this strange transformation, ritualized and almost theatrical, that convinced many she was not merely unlucky in love. She was crafting her own legend, one husband at a time. The ledger of death among the few possessions left behind after Constance's final days was a small, leather-bound ledger. At first glance, it appeared to be no more than household accounts lists of purchases, payments to farmhands, and debts owed. But as one curious neighbor flipped through its yellowed pages, an unsettling pattern revealed itself. Each entry bore a date, a man's name, and a series of numbers written in Constance's sharp, deliberate hand. Next to her first husband's name, she had marked 2 weeks, steady decline. For the second, 3 nights, violent, retching fective. For the third, slow fever, well masked. And for the fourth, quickest yet, only hours. The ledger did not read like bookkeeping, it read like experimentation. What chilled those who read it most were not the details of illness, but the detached tone. Her notes were cold, clinical, as if each man were no more than a specimen in a study. Occasionally, she added remarks like bitter aftertaste, must disguise better, or dosage correct, but pacing suspicious. The townsfolk whispered that Constance had turned her marriages into a private science, refining her recipe with each attempt, sharpening her skills until no suspicion could cling to her for long. In those pages, her humanity seemed absent, replaced by the precision of a chemist or a predator. Even more disturbing was a final, unfinished entry. No husband's name was attached. Instead, it simply read, "Next one. Wealth secured, burial, swift." A blank space followed, as though she had already planned her next move but had not lived long enough to complete it. This ledger was never presented in court. It surfaced only after her own death, but it circulated through town like a cursed artifact. People swore the book itself carried her shadow, that reading it invited her cold presence into one's home. Some claimed it vanished for years at a time, only to resurface in another family's attic, wrapped in cloth as though its very touch might burn. In the end, the ledger became more than a record. It was proof of intention, of calculation, and it left a lingering question. How many more names might have filled its pages if fate hadn't intervened? The house that wouldn't let go long after Constance's death, her house remained. At first it was rented to passing families, merchants, men seeking a fresh start, but none stayed for long. They all left with stories. Some swore they heard coughing in the night, like the choking gasps of a man whose lungs had filled with poison. Others said they saw a pale woman standing at the edge of their bed, her outline faint, but her eyes cold and deliberate, as though measuring them for the grave. The house had a smell too, not the scent of rot, nor of age, but something sharper, metallic, almost like medicine spilled and left to sour. No amount of scrubbing seemed to remove it. Children who lived there often grew sick. Pets would vanish, only to be found lifeless in the cellar. By the 1880s, no tenant would go near the place. Locals began to call it the widow's nest. They said Constance's spirit had never left, that she lingered in the halls, searching for her next victim. Finishing the entry she had left blank in her ledger, one particularly chilling tale tells of a young boy who dared to sneak inside the abandoned house one autumn night. He carried only a lantern. When he returned, he was pale, shaking, unable to speak for days. When his voice returned, he claimed he had found a small wooden box beneath the floorboards. Inside were fragments of glass vials, still crusted with a strange black residue. He swore the moment he touched one, the lantern flame flickered out, and a whisper hissed in his ear, "Too much, too soon." The boy never set foot near the property again. The house eventually rotted into ruin, but the land itself never sold. Farmers avoided planting near it, as though the soil carried something unnatural. Even today, locals insist that nothing grows properly there. A barren patch remains, like a scar that time itself refuses to heal. And so the legend of Constance Addington bled into the earth she once walked, her memory etched, not just in stories, but in the very bones of the land. The ledger closes. The story of Constance Addington is not just a tale of one woman's crimes. It is a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human nature. She lived in an era when women were expected to be silent, obedient, and fragile. Yet, Constance defied that image, not through bravery or defiance of oppression, but through something colder. She discovered power in poison, and in silence, a kind of dominion few suspected until it was too late. Her ledger pages of careful handwriting, lines drawn like accounts in a merchant's book, was her true confession, not to police, not to neighbors, not to God. It was a confession to herself, a record that proved she wanted her acts remembered, even if she never admitted them aloud. But here lies the most unsettling part. There are many who still doubt the full extent of her crimes. Some historians claim the deaths could have been coincidence, illness, misfortune. They argue that the widow's nest is more legend than fact, that Constance has been turned into a ghost story, her name twisted by time. And yet, too many patterns remain. Too many accounts from doctors, ministers, and neighbors who felt something unnatural around her. Too many blank spaces in her ledger, as though she stopped mid-sentence, confident that others would one day complete her story. Tonight, her house is gone. The widow herself is dust. But when you walk through that barren patch of earth where nothing grows, the air is still different, heavier, quiet, in the way a room falls silent when someone enters unseen. Perhaps Constance got what she wanted all along. Perhaps she became immortal, not through mercy or kindness, but through whispers carried from one frightened voice to the next, a legacy of unease. And as you close this story, ask yourself what's more terrifying: a murderer who is caught and punished, or one who slips into the soil, who becomes rumor, who remains just uncertain enough that you can never be sure she isn't still there, waiting. The ledger is closed, but the name written across its cover, Constance Addington, never be erased.